The entire hotel bar fell silent as the drunk guests staggered backward, staring in disbelief at the man standing calmly between him and the terrified waiter, realizing far too late that he had just shoved someone under the protection of Mike Tyson, and what happened in the next few minutes would become a story told by staff and guests for years. But to understand how a simple late-night drink inside one of Las Vegas's most expensive hotels turned into a moment that left an entire room gasping, we need to go back to the beginning of that evening when Mike Tyson walked into the bar hoping for nothing more than quiet, privacy, and a few minutes away from the chaos that had followed him for most of his life. It was the spring of 2005, and Mike was in Las Vegas for a charity boxing exhibition, staying at a luxury resort known for hosting celebrities, high rollers, and international business elites, the kind of place where the lighting was dim enough to feel exclusive, but bright enough to remind guests how expensive everything around them was. And by the time Mike stepped into the bar around 11:30 p.m., the room was buzzing with low conversation, jazz music drifting softly from a live trio in the corner, and bartenders moving with the precision and calm efficiency expected in establishments where a single drink cost more than some people's daily wages. Mike wasn't dressed like a celebrity that night, wearing a simple black jacket, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, hoping to blend into the crowd the way he sometimes could when people weren't expecting to see one of the most recognizable athletes in the world sitting quietly alone, and he chose a seat at the far end of the marble bar, positioning himself where he could see both the entrance and the lounge seating area behind him, a habit developed from years of living in environments where awareness wasn't optional but necessary for survival. The bartender approached him cautiously, recognizing him almost immediately, but professional enough not to make a scene, and Mike ordered sparkling water instead of alcohol, something he had been doing more often in recent years as he worked through personal struggles and tried to maintain control over parts of his life that once felt uncontrollable. And for the next 40 minutes he sat quietly, occasionally nodding politely when guests walked past, listening to the soft clinking of glasses and muted laughter echoing through the polished room, a peaceful atmosphere that felt rare and valuable to someone whose public life had often been defined by headlines, controversy, and confrontation. Most guests hadn't noticed him, too focused on their own conversations, business deals, or romantic evenings to scan the room for famous faces, and the hotel staff, trained to treat celebrities with respectful discretion, left him undisturbed, allowing him to exist in that rare pocket of anonymity that very few global icons ever experience. But across the lounge area near a curved leather seating section, another story was quietly beginning to unfold, one that would soon pull Mike's attention, whether he wanted it or not. The man who would trigger everything was a wealthy guest named Richard Halvorson, a tech entrepreneur visiting from Chicago who had reportedly closed a multi-million-dollar deal earlier that evening and decided to celebrate with expensive whiskey. And by the time he reached his sixth drink, his voice had grown louder, his movements less controlled, and his patience almost non-existent, while the young waiter assigned to his section, a nervous but polite employee named Daniel who had only worked at the hotel for 3 months, was doing everything possible to maintain professionalism under increasingly difficult circumstances. Daniel had already apologized twice for delays caused by an unusually crowded bar, but Richard interpreted every wait as personal disrespect, his irritation growing with each passing minute, and guests seated nearby had started exchanging uncomfortable glances as his voice rose. Above the music, the kind of tension hospitality workers recognize instantly, but often struggle to defuse without escalating situations further. Meanwhile, Mike remained at the bar, quietly sipping his drink, but he had begun to notice the shift in the room's energy, conversations near the lounge slowing slightly, heads turning subtly toward the source of raised voices. And like many fighters who spend their lives reading opponents before punches are thrown, Mike had developed an instinct for recognizing conflict long before it exploded into violence. Daniel approached Richard's table again, carefully balancing a tray with fresh glasses and attempting another calm apology, his voice respectful, measured, exactly the tone hospitality training demanded. But Richard barely listened, interrupting him mid-sentence and accusing him loudly of ignoring VIP guests, his words slurring slightly, but his anger growing sharper with each complaint. And several nearby patrons began quietly gathering their belongings, instinctively creating distance from a situation that felt like it might spiral beyond verbal frustration. Daniel attempted to place the drinks carefully on the table, his hands steady despite visible anxiety. But Richard suddenly slapped the table, startling the waiter and causing one of the glasses to wobble dangerously close to the tray's edge. And while Daniel quickly steadied it, the moment embarrassed Richard in front of the surrounding guests, fueling his frustration instead of calming it. Back at the bar, Mike's posture shifted slightly, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, his shoulders straightening as he glanced toward the reflection of the lounge area visible in the polished mirror behind the liquor shelves, silently observing without moving, without interfering, because experience had taught him that stepping into conflicts too early sometimes made situations worse instead of better. Daniel offered another apology and promised faster service moving forward. But Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and the sudden movement drew nearly every eye in the lounge area as he leaned closer to Daniel, towering over him, his face flushed with alcohol and anger, and in a sharp, dismissive gesture that seemed small but carried enormous weight, he shoved Daniel backward, knocking the tray sideways and sending crystal glasses crashing onto the carpeted floor, the sharp sound of breaking glass cutting through the jazz music like a gunshot and freezing the entire room in stunned silence. Daniel stumbled, nearly falling, immediately apologizing again despite being the one pushed, instinctively trying to gather shattered glass with shaking hands while Richard continued shouting about service quality and personal respect. And across the bar, Mike Tyson slowly set his glass down, his eyes locked on the unfolding scene, knowing from experience that moments like this rarely ended peacefully once humiliation and alcohol mixed together. And although he hadn't moved yet, anyone who truly understood Mike Tyson would have recognized the quiet transformation happening behind his calm expression, because history had shown that Mike Tyson rarely looked for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And tonight, inside a luxury hotel bar filled with wealthy guests, polished marble, and soft jazz music, trouble was about to make a decision it couldn't take back. Daniel's hands were still shaking as he crouched down, trying to gather broken glass with a folded napkin, his face pale and his movements rushed, not because of the shattered glasses, but because he could feel the entire room watching him. And for a hospitality worker, public humiliation often cut deeper than physical danger. While Richard stood over him, swaying slightly, his anger fueled by alcohol and the uncomfortable awareness that dozens of strangers had just witnessed him lose control. And instead of calming down, he doubled down, his voice rising louder as he accused Daniel of ruining his night and embarrassing him in front of clients who were now quietly slipping away from the table, unwilling to stay near a scene that felt seconds away from escalating. Several staff members began moving toward the lounge cautiously, including a floor supervisor signaling security near the entrance. But luxury hotels operated under strict guidelines to avoid physical confrontations with guests unless absolutely necessary, meaning Daniel was still alone in front of an increasingly unpredictable man. "Stand up when I'm talking to you," Richard barked suddenly, his voice sharp enough to cut through the music, and Daniel froze for a moment before slowly standing, his posture respectful but tense, his training telling him to remain calm while his instincts told him to create distance. Yet before he could step back, Richard shoved him again, harder this time, sending Daniel stumbling into a nearby table, knocking over a candle and scattering menus across the polished floor, and the collective gasp from surrounding guests spread through the bar like a ripple across still water. Phones began lifting subtly, not openly recording yet, but hovering at chest level, ready, sensing something historic or disastrous might unfold. That was the moment Mike Tyson stood up from the bar. There was no sudden rush, no aggressive posture, just the quiet, deliberate movement of someone who had spent his entire life understanding timing. And he placed his glass carefully onto the marble counter before turning toward the lounge, his expression calm, almost detached, yet focused with the unmistakable awareness of someone who had stepped into thousands of high-pressure moments before. He walked across the room with slow, steady steps, guests instinctively shifting aside without being asked, sensing authority in his movement that required no announcement. And he stopped roughly 3 feet from Richard, positioning himself naturally between the drunk guest and a shaken waiter. "Hey," Mike said quietly, his voice soft enough that only nearby tables heard him, but firm enough to cut through the tension instantly, and Richard turned toward him with irritated confusion, his mind struggling to process recognition through layers of alcohol and ego. "Mind your business," Richard slurred, attempting to wave him off dismissively, but Mike didn't move. He simply nodded toward Daniel. "He's just doing his job," Mike said calmly, his tone neutral, not accusing, not threatening, just stating something obvious that suddenly felt heavy with meaning. Richard laughed loudly, trying to reclaim dominance in front of the growing audience. "You telling me how to act?" he snapped, stepping closer, invading Mike's personal space with exaggerated confidence, and security guards approaching from the entrance slowed their pace when they recognized Mike, exchanging uncertain glances as they evaluated whether their involvement would help or escalate the situation further. Mike remained still, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and controlled. "He apologized," Mike continued quietly. "That should have been enough." Richard leaned closer, his breath heavy with whiskey, and poked Mike in the chest with a single finger, a small gesture that somehow carried enormous tension. The kind of gesture that had started countless fights in countless bars across the world, and for 2 long seconds, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if one of the most dangerous fighters in boxing history would respond with the violence that had made him legendary. Instead, Mike reached forward slowly, placing his hand firmly on Richard's shoulder, not gripping, not squeezing, just applying steady, immovable pressure, and when Richard instinctively tried to push forward again, his body stopped completely, as if he had collided with an invisible barrier, his expression shifting from drunken arrogance to confused realization as he discovered he couldn't move Mike even slightly. Mike leaned closer, speaking quietly enough that only Richard and the nearest guests could hear him. "You don't want this moment to define your night," Mike said calmly, his voice steady and measured. "Sit down, drink some water, and apologize." Richard attempted to laugh again, but the sound came out weaker, uncertain, and something in Mike's eyes, not anger, not intimidation, but complete certainty, began cutting through the haze of alcohol clouding his judgment, and as security finally reached them, positioning themselves cautiously nearby, Richard's shoulders slowly relaxed, the aggressive energy draining from him as he stepped backward, blinking rapidly, realizing the situation had shifted completely beyond his control. He looked toward Daniel, who stood frozen near the overturned table, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, Richard muttered, I'm sorry," barely loud enough to be heard, but loud enough to release the tension gripping the entire lounge, and the room exhaled collectively. Conversations restarting slowly, phones lowering, guests exchanging stunned glances at how close the situation had come to exploding into something far worse, while Mike simply removed his hand from Richard's shoulder and stepped back, allowing security to gently guide the embarrassed guest toward the exit, his calm intervention ending the confrontation without a single punch thrown, yet leaving behind a silence filled with awe, disbelief, and the unmistakable understanding that everyone in that room had just witnessed a different kind of strength, one far more difficult to control than violence. Security escorted Richard toward the exit quietly, his earlier confidence completely gone, his steps slower, heavier, guided more by embarrassment than by the firm but respectful hands of the hotel staff. And as the glass doors closed behind him, the lounge slowly returned to movement, conversations restarting in cautious whispers, guests exchanging stunned looks as they tried to process how close the night had come to turning into chaos, while Daniel remained standing near the overturned table, still gripping the folded napkin he had been using to clean the shattered glasses, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he was unsure whether he was allowed to relax yet. Mike turned toward him, his expression calm, almost casual, like the last few minutes hadn't drawn the attention of nearly every person in the room. "You okay?" Mike asked quietly. Daniel nodded quickly, though his voice trembled slightly when he answered. "Yes, sir, thank you." Mike shook his head gently. "You don't have to thank me. You handled yourself the right way." Daniel blinked, surprised by the response, clearly not expecting encouragement from someone he had watched dominate boxing rings across the world. "Most people would have lost their temper," Mike continued. "You didn't. That takes more strength than people realize." The floor supervisor approached carefully, apologizing repeatedly for the situation, promising Daniel a break and assuring Mike the hotel would handle everything. But Mike waved off the attention politely and walked back toward the bar, where the bartender had already placed another sparkling water in front of his seat without asking, his silent gesture carrying the quiet respect shared among people who had just witnessed something unforgettable. That could have gone very differently, the bartender said softly as Mike sat down. Mike shrugged slightly, resting his elbows lightly against the marble counter. Most things can, he replied simply, taking a small sip of his drink, his demeanor returning to the same quiet calm he had carried earlier that night, as if stepping into conflict and stepping out of it were both routine parts of his life. Across the lounge, guests slowly resumed their evenings, but the energy had changed, the earlier relaxed luxury replaced by a subtle awareness that they had just seen a moment few people ever experience firsthand, and several guests quietly approached Mike over the next few minutes, thanking him, shaking his hand, or asking for photos, which he accepted politely, but without enthusiasm, clearly uncomfortable with attention drawn from situations involving conflict rather than celebration. About 20 minutes later, the head of hotel security approached Mike directly, a tall man in a tailored suit whose posture carried both authority and careful respect. "Mr. Tyson," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "we appreciate how you handled that. Most people in your position might have reacted differently." Mike smiled faintly, not looking up from his glass immediately. "Most people don't live with the consequences I do," he said quietly, and the security chief hesitated, unsure whether to respond, sensing there was more truth in that statement than Mike intended to explain. After a brief pause, Mike added, "It's easy to hurt somebody. That part doesn't take much skill. The hard part is knowing when not to." The security chief nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words, before thanking Mike again and stepping away, leaving him alone once more with the quiet hum of jazz music returning to fill the lounge. Around midnight, Mike placed cash on the counter, standing slowly as he prepared to leave, and as he walked toward the exit, Daniel approached him again, his uniform slightly wrinkled from the earlier chaos, but his posture steadier now. "Sir," Daniel said cautiously, "I just wanted to say, I'll remember tonight for the rest of my life." Mike paused, studying the young waiter for a moment before nodding slightly. "Then remember." "The right part," Mike said, "not what he did. Remember that staying calm gave you control. Losing control gives it to someone else." Daniel nodded, clearly committing the words to memory, and Mike continued walking toward the elevator lobby, disappearing into the quiet luxury of the hotel corridors, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than another passing moment in a lifetime filled with unpredictable encounters. But inside the bar, the story had already begun spreading, first among staff whispering in service hallways, then among guests texting friends, then among security teams recounting the incident during shift briefings, and within days, the story became part of hotel training sessions, used to teach new employees how quickly situations could escalate and how powerful calm authority could be when used correctly. Daniel remained at the hotel for several years, eventually becoming a supervisor himself, and whenever new staff struggled with difficult guests, he told them about the night a drunk millionaire nearly turned a luxury lounge into a disaster, and how one of the most feared fighters in boxing history solved the situation without raising his voice or throwing a punch, explaining that true strength wasn't about proving power but controlling it. Years later, long after renovations changed the design of the lounge and many of the original staff had moved on to other careers, the story still surfaced among employees who had never even worked there during Mike's visit, passed down like a modern legend that blended celebrity with something far more meaningful, and guests who happened to overhear the story often reacted the same way, surprised not by the idea of Mike Tyson stopping a confrontation, but by how he stopped it, with restraint, instead of violence. Mike himself never spoke publicly about the incident, never confirmed it, never denied it, because to him it wasn't a defining moment or a heroic act, just another reminder of lessons he had learned the hardest way possible throughout his life, lessons about anger, ego, control, and consequences, and for everyone else who witnessed that night. The memory remained vivid not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. No fight, no broken furniture, no injuries, just a room full of people gasping as they watched one man demonstrate that the most dangerous kind of strength is the kind that never needs to show itself. And long after the broken glasses were replaced and the carpet cleaned, the lesson Tyson left behind stayed stronger than any punch he could have thrown, a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't fight back. It's choose not to fight at all.